Well, good afternoon and welcome to our program. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. We have a fascinating program today with the award-winning author and historian, Amy Butler Greenfield, who's going to be drawing from her recent book, The Woman All Spies Fear, as she talks about the inspiring true story of Elizebeth Smith Friedman, an American woman who was one of the top US codebreakers, both during World War I and World War II. Before we get to her presentation, I want to first let you know that this recording will be made available on YouTube, probably not till tomorrow morning or so, but we are recording this for people who want to watch it later. I also want to mention a couple of our other upcoming programs that I hope you'll be interested in. We have two programs this coming Thursday. The first will be at 2 o'clock when HMTC joins the Museum of Jewish Heritage to hold a panel discussion entitled Nazis on Long Island, the story of Camp Siegfried. I hope you'll join us to hear about the surprising history of support for the Nazi Party here on Long Island. This was back in the 1930s. The second program we have on Thursday is in the evening when I will be leading a virtual tour of Ellis Island, which opened 130 years ago this month. So I hope that you will join me to learn about that federal immigration station that played such a pivotal role in the experience of Jewish and Italian immigrants who came to the US in the early 20th century. And one more program to mention, on Sunday, next Sunday, January 23rd at 6 p.m., we'll be holding the next program in our Sunday with Survivor series. Holocaust survivor Rosalie Simon will share information about her life in Czechoslovakia before the war, her deportation to Auschwitz, her selection by Dr. Mengele, and her various escapes from death thanks to the kindness of strangers. So I hope you'll join us to hear that program. You can find details about these programs and our full schedule on our website at www.hmtcli.org and then click on the Events tab. Okay, enough of my advertisements. Let me stop my screen share and introduce our speaker for today, author and historian Amy Butler Greenfield. Amy was born here in the United States and attended Williams College before studying at Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. She's published a number of books. Her first was A Perfect Red, about the quest through history for the perfect color red, which won a number of book prizes and was the Washington Post's best book, one of their best books of 2005. She's also written a number of other books. She has a series of young adult novels about Ra the Mighty, a cat detective, in which she weaves together ancient Egyptian history with engaging mysteries. Among the other books that she's written, which I won't talk about, but one I will, and that is her most recent, The Woman All Spies Fear, which she will be drawing from for today's presentation. As she will explain, she uncovered the hidden accomplishments of Elizebeth Smith Friedman, a woman who became one of America's great codebreakers in both World War I and World War II, and who worked during the Holocaust to track down Nazi spies, but whose story was pushed into the shadows due to a combination of sexism and concerns about national security. Amy pulls Elizebeth Smith Friedman's story from the shadows in a riveting book that sometimes reads like a suspense thriller, and I know she will share some of that amazing story with us this afternoon. So with that introduction, I am delighted to bring Amy Butler Greenfield to our virtual stage. Oops, I hope she's not having difficulty. I will add one more comment, hopefully while Amy is turning on her computer and comes in, and that is that if you have questions for Amy Butler Greenfield during the presentation, please use the Q&A window of Zoom, type your questions in, and I will make sure that she sees them at the end of the program where we have some time for discussion. So with that planned, I pass it over to you, Amy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that welcome. Thank you for having me here. And thank you to everybody who has made time for this talk today during what has been a difficult weekend for many. I am so glad to be able to talk with you today about the life of codebreaker Elizebeth Smith Friedman. I have lots of wonderful images to share with you, so let me take a moment so that I can share my screen with you. There. So this is Elizebeth Smith Friedman, whose extraordinary career began in 1916. By the late 1930s, she was one of the most famous codebreakers in the world. Yet her success was hushed up, and she was pushed into those shadows of history. For over half a century, she was almost completely forgotten. Even to those in the know, she was overshadowed by her husband, William Frederick Friedman. One of the most famous codebreakers in history, he was the man in charge of the team that solved the Japanese cipher Purple in 1940. He was a key special advisor at the National Security Agency in the 1950s. He's sometimes called the Dean of American Cryptology and the godfather of the NSA. For decades, many people assumed that William Friedman was the only brilliant codebreaker in the family, but Elizebeth was brilliant too, as William himself was always quick to point out. They had a long, happy marriage, but they rarely worked together. Elizebeth Friedman's achievements were her own. In fact, it was Elizebeth who introduced William to cryptology and not the other way around. When asked how he became a codebreaker, William had a succinct reply: "I was seduced." In this talk, I will tell you more about that seduction and about Elizebeth's long and remarkable career in codebreaking, a career that involved everything from Shakespeare to gangsters to Enigma machines. Elizebeth was born in 1892, the ninth and last surviving child of Indiana farmers. She didn't like to talk about her childhood, and this is one of the only images we have of her family. She is the tiny child in the front, sickly and small for her age. Her father, John Smith, was a domineering man. He and Elizebeth didn't get along. But her mother, Sophia Smith, you can see her over and sitting down on the right there. Sophia Smith was Elizabeth's champion. A former school teacher, she was almost certainly the reason why Elizebeth aimed at going to college, a rare ambition in those days. "My mother encouraged me to go my own way," Elizebeth once said. This is the Smith family farmhouse, where Elizebeth spent most of her childhood. It's often said that she was raised as a Quaker, but this is a myth. Her family attended the local Church of God rather than Quaker meetings. What the Smith family did have were Quaker ancestors on her father's side. He was proud of this, and so was Elizebeth. She applied to Quaker colleges because she hoped this would win over her father, who did not approve of higher education for women. Unfortunately, she didn't get in. A year later, she finally got into a non-Quaker college in Ohio, and somehow she persuaded her father to lend her the money to go. He drove a hard bargain, demanding she pay back every penny at 6% interest. But to Elizebeth, it seemed a price worth paying. Here's a photo of her taken around this time. As an undergraduate, she studied languages, philosophy, and English. Around the time she earned her BA, she also became engaged to a younger student, a poet named Harold Van Kirk. While he continued his studies, she got a job in teaching in Indiana so she could pay back the loan so that her father would get back his 6% interest. She soon discovered that she hated teaching. Then her engagement collapsed. The end of the relationship threw Elizebeth into deep despair. She feared she would spend her life all alone, chained to jobs she hated, marking papers and marking time. She wrote in her diary that she wished passionately, day after day, only to die. Desperate for a fresh start, she took a train to Chicago to search for another job in late May 1916. After pounding the pavement, she stopped at the city's famous Newberry Library, which had a first folio, that is, a first edition of Shakespeare's plays, printed in 1623. She impressed a librarian there, who made a phone call to a possible employer. Minutes later, a huge man with a bellowing voice strode in. Before Elizabeth knew what was happening, he swept her out of the library. They boarded a train headed for a place called Riverbank. The man's name was George Fabian, and you can see him standing here with Elizabeth. He was a textile millionaire, and Riverbank was his estate, about an hour from Chicago. It was also home to a one-of-a-kind research center that Fabian himself had founded. His pet project was run by a woman named Elizabeth Wells Gallup. Gallup was studying Shakespeare's first folio and the variations in its letters. You can see examples of those subtle differences here. Gallup was convinced that these variations served a purpose, that they were a cipher carrying secret messages. She needed a new assistant, and Elizabeth got the job. Here she is with Gallup and Gallup's sister, Kate. Elizabeth is on the left. Elizabeth loved Shakespeare, and she loved learning more about codes and ciphers. She also enjoyed everyday life at Riverbank, which included swimming, fine dining, and late-night joyrides in a fancy sports car called a Stutz Bearcat. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't confirm any of the secret messages that Gallup claimed to have found. At first, that made Elizabeth feel like a failure. Then she began to wonder if maybe Gallup was seeing messages that weren't really there. For a while, Elizabeth kept her doubts to herself. Fabian had a temper, and he didn't like to be crossed, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. After a while, however, she confided in another Riverbank employee, a young scientist. This was William Friedman. Born in Kishinev in what was then Russia, he had arrived in Pittsburgh with his family when he was just a toddler. Despite the dire poverty and prejudice his family faced, he had managed to earn a place at Cornell, where he had studied genetics before coming to work at Riverbank. You can see him sitting next to Elizabeth in this photo on a porch at Riverbank. Thanks to Elizabeth, William started taking an interest in cryptology. He also took an interest in Elizabeth. Both would turn out to be lifelong passions. The two of them became convinced that the Shakespeare project was nonsense. They were absolutely right, but when they finally told Fabian so, he was furious with them. Then he decided he had bigger fish to fry. He ordered them to set up a department of ciphers at Riverbank. And then he offered their services to the Army, just as America was entering World War I. At the time, the United States had hardly any good codebreakers. So Elizabeth and William ended up leading the country's main US-based codebreaking unit. They were only in their mid-20s, but they were responsible for decrypting secret messages, not only for the Army, but also the State Department, the Justice Department, the Navy, and even the Post Office. Later in the war, they also created the Army's main codebreaking school, and they did all of this from Riverbank. Working as a team, Elizabeth and William spent hours together day after day. After a month or so of this, they eloped. Here they are on their wedding day, looking rather overwhelmed. There was strong family opposition to the match, chiefly on religious grounds. William was Jewish, she was not. Neither planned to convert, and neither family was happy about that. They went ahead anyway. In May 1917, they married in a Chicago synagogue. William was sad to have caused pain to his family, but otherwise he had no regrets. He adored Elizabeth, body and soul. For Elizabeth, the question was more complicated. She had seen too many women trapped in unhappy marriages, and after her devastating experience with her college fiancé, she didn't trust herself to love anyone wholeheartedly again. So even though she considered William her dearest friend, to marry him was a big gamble. It was only after the wedding that he won her heart. It helped that William truly wanted a marriage of equals, a very unusual idea at the time. It also helped that when they worked together, something magic happened. Attuned to each other to an almost spooky degree, they achieved things that others considered impossible. Amazingly, the two of them could crack almost any message within 2 hours. Elizabeth loved the moment when a solution emerged. "The skeletons of words leap out and make you jump," she once wrote. But there was trouble on the horizon. The war that had brought them together was about to split them apart. In 1918, William was sent to France to serve as a codebreaker near the front lines. Here he is with Elizabeth just before he went overseas. Female codebreakers weren't allowed to serve outside the US, so Elizabeth couldn't join him. Alone at Riverbank, she was harassed by Fabian, who also insisted she return to the Shakespeare project that she no longer believed in. She took the only option left to her and went home to look after her widowed father. By the end of the war, William was seen by the Army as a code-breaking genius, and he really was one. Soon he was writing papers that would transform the foundations of cryptology. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was back in Indiana, cooking and scrubbing floors for her father. There, as she later put it, she began to realize what it meant to be a champion swimmer stranded in the Sahara. By the end of the war, her code-breaking skills had atrophied, and she was known mostly as William's wife. As you can see here, she was overjoyed when William came home from France in 1919. Yet when it came to code-breaking, she knew she had fallen behind him. She did not see how she could ever catch up. It was, she wrote, an altogether hopeless prospect. At the end of 1920, the War Department offered them both jobs in Washington, D.C., but Elizabeth was hired essentially as William's assistant for about half the pay. After a year on the job, she quit. There's been speculation about why, but I found the answer on a scrap of legal pad buried in a pile of miscellaneous papers in her archive. She resigned, she wrote, in the hope of having a child. When the hoped-for baby didn't materialize, she took a cryptology job with the Navy, only to fall ill almost immediately with severe morning sickness, the first sign of what would be a very complicated pregnancy. She had to give up the job, but she and the baby survived. Here's a photo of her with her husband and daughter. Over the next few years, as she endured periods of ill health and had another baby, she undertook jobs she could do at home, some private code work and drafting a book on code breaking for teens. What pulled her back into full-time code breaking was Prohibition, or to be more precise, the Coast Guard's battle to enforce it. Like many Americans, she was shocked by the links between rum running and organized crime. By 1924, some $500 million a year in illegal booze was entering the US. Most of the profits were going to the pockets of gangsters. This made it easy for them to run rings around law enforcement. Violent crime soared. Outmanned and outgunned by the rum runners, the Coast Guard's only hope was to outsmart them by decrypting their radio messages. These revealed when and where the illegal cargoes were being transferred and landed. But the gang's radio networks were vast. This diagram from Elizabeth's archive shows how complicated they could be, with many different vessels, channels, and code types. Aware that they needed a top-notch cryptographer, the Coast Guard offered the job to Elizabeth, mostly because they believed her husband would help her with the work. They had no idea that Elizabeth by herself was up to the job. But in just over 3 years, working almost entirely on her own, Elizabeth solved a staggering 12,000 secret messages for the Coast Guard and its allies. By late 1930, she estimated she had seen nearly 50 distinct systems of secret communication. She cracked them all, a remarkable feat, only to see even more challenging ones take their place. Day after day, she was forced to grapple with them alone. It was demanding work. At times, it seemed nearly impossible, but it was the making of her. Just as her husband's skills had grown by leaps and bounds while he was overseas in France, Elizabeth's talents were now undergoing a similar transformation. Month by month, she honed her talents until she stood once more in the vanguard of the field. When the government started using her as an expert witness in rum-runner trials, Elizebeth became famous. Here she is on her doorstep on her way to a court trial in 1934. What really put her in the public eye was a case in which a lawyer for the Capone family repeatedly questioned her expertise. Finally, Elizebeth turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, is there a blackboard available to the court?" When a blackboard was brought forward, Elizebeth gave everyone a lesson in the basics of code breaking. To her surprise, the blackboard story set the press on fire, in her own phrase. Articles about Elizebeth appeared all over the country with bold headlines and photos. Throughout the 1930s, as Prohibition ended and Elizebeth moved into narcotics work, the interest continued. Eventually, she was making headlines all over the world. Here are some of the many newspaper clippings that she saved. This one is an article from the DC Sunday Star. She breaks up smugglers' plots by decoding their notes for Uncle Sam. This is a more sedate article that appeared in the Christian Science Monitor. And this one was the kind of lurid article she hated, how the G2 woman trapped the dope ring. In 1939, a newspaper called her the Woman All Spies Fear. Elizebeth was upset by that article because it came too close to the truth. World War II was on the horizon. For the United States, it had begun in Europe. She had been reassigned to new top secret duties. At that point, she went dark and she stopped talking with the press. The articles stopped. Here she is at work in 1940. For many decades, the exact nature of her wartime work remained secret. It was known that in 1941, she created the secret communication systems for America's wartime spy network, the precursor to the CIA. The rest of her duties, however, were a mystery. Thanks to recently declassified documents, we now know exactly what she was up to. She was the lead codebreaker in a unit that monitored clandestine radio communications in the Americas, with a special focus on Nazi spies in South America. One of her chief targets was this man, Johannes Siegfried Becker, codenamed Sargo. We tend to overlook South America in our histories of World War II, but at the time it was a real headache for the Allies. It was rich in Nazi sympathizers, and it was also rich in exactly the kinds of resources that the Nazis needed. If they could establish air bases in South America, they could leapfrog their way up to the Panama Canal Zone and seize control of it. At that point, it was feared their bombers would soon be in range of the United States itself. To some, these fears seemed overblown, but the prospect horrified the Roosevelt administration, and Elizabeth's unit was seen as a key part of America's secret defenses. At first, most of the South American spies used low-grade ciphers for their radio broadcasts to their German handlers. That made them easy targets for someone with Elizabeth's extensive experience. Later in the war, however, the Germans gave important spies like Sargo a present, Enigma, the cipher machines they believed were unbreakable. These machines were a type known as Enigma G or Abwehr Enigma. You can see one here. It was a medium security Enigma model that was easier to solve than the highest grade ones. Like all Enigmas, however, it was no piece of cake. Armed with tips from British codebreakers, the masters of Enigma, Elizabeth and her team tackled the messages, solved them with pen and paper, and recovered the machine wiring, which helped with the solution of subsequent messages. It's worth noting that this same work, often on the same messages, was also being done in the UK, also with pen and paper, and also largely by women. Yet Elizabeth's initiative impressed British officials. Some had hoped to bring her to the UK's codebreaking centre at Bletchley Park. Other officials panicked. The ability to break Enigma was Britain's most critical secret, essential to winning the war. That secret would be blown if Elizabeth's Enigma decrypts fell into the wrong hands. The wrong hands that the Brits were chiefly worried about were those of the FBI, and for good reason. Earlier in the war, J. Edgar Hoover and his G-men had often demanded Elizabeth's help with codebreaking. In public, they then took credit for that work. And at crucial points, the FBI had shared her decrypts inappropriately, alerting the Nazis to her work and scattering the spies whose network she was secretly milking. With a record like that, no wonder the Brits feared the FBI would blow the Enigma secret wide open. Luckily, the top brass on the US side, as well as Elizabeth and her unit, had realized that it was foolhardy to give the decrypts to Hoover. That new policy helped keep the Enigma secret safe. Later on, after the South American spy networks were finally broken up, the FBI claimed the credit for breaking their codes. Papers all over the country covered the story, and the FBI basked in honor and glory. Of course, it was really Elizabeth and her team who had done that work, but they had been sworn to secrecy under the Espionage Act, so they couldn't set the record straight. In 1944, the FBI also claimed credit for the code breaking in the doll woman spy case. This involved an American doll shop owner who wrote coded letters to her Axis handlers. It was Elizabeth who did most of the vital code breaking that allowed the spy to be convicted, but the FBI wasn't going to admit that. Again, Elizabeth was obliged by the Espionage Act and her own sense of honor to keep quiet about who had done the real work. She kept these wartime secrets all her life, and that is part of why she is not better known today. In the past few years, Elizabeth has started finally to get credit for that war work, both what she did on her own and what she did as part of a team. You can see her here with one of those team members, Robert Gordon, whom she trained from the ground up. But even as we celebrate all that she did in World War II, we shouldn't lose sight of how she herself felt about those years. For her, it was a time of great frustration. In her view, she and her unit were not well deployed, and their talents were often wasted. Why did she feel that way? Certainly, it was exciting to work with Enigma, but that was only a small part of her job. And she knew that this work was often being duplicated by British codebreakers. The rest of the South American spy material was rarely a challenge for her top-notch team. She always believed that her unit, as she put it, could have been better used on more important projects. Which begs the question, what sort of important projects did she have in mind? My guess is that she was thinking of Japanese Navy codes. In the 1930s, when helping to break several international smuggling rings, she had shown an incredible aptitude for breaking complex Asian language codes, even though she spoke very little of the language. She knew root characters of Chinese, and that was about it, but she still could break the codes and ciphers. She knew that Japanese Navy codes were of much greater strategic importance than the South American spy channel. But Elizabeth did not have the power to direct how her unit was used. In fact, during the war, she was no longer even the unit's official leader. When the US entered World War II, a male officer had been put in charge of her unit over her head, even though he had less code-breaking experience than she did. When she requested that her unit be given more challenging and more critical missions, she was stonewalled. After the spy rings in South America were broken up in early 1944, she spent most of the rest of the war monitoring low-level communications that had little strategic value. After the war, her boss received 6 different honors and medals for the unit's work. Elizabeth received none. When the war ended, she recommended that her code-breaking unit be axed. It's clear from her papers that she was glad to move on. She then worked for the IMF for several years, creating their first secret communication systems. Then she retired. One of the most poignant aspects of Elizabeth's long career was that she and her husband were often required to keep secrets from each other. At the very start of their career, they both worked for Riverbank, but from 1922 onward, they served different masters. William worked for the Army, while Elizabeth worked for the Coast Guard and Navy. at a time when the Army and Navy were fierce rivals. Military officials often suspected the Friedmans of spilling secrets to each other. They were not allowed to share between the Army and the Navy. They were one of the only married couples in American code breaking. Nobody quite knew how to handle the situation. But as Elizabeth herself put it, the rule she and William lived by was just never, never say anything. It was impossible, of course, to hide everything. When Elizabeth saw what she called a certain grim look on William's mouth, she would know something had gone wrong. Likewise, she said, any expression on my face he certainly could read. But they both did their best to forget what they saw. I tried to know as little as possible, Elizabeth later said. By the late 1930s, the stakes were so high that you just hoped and prayed you wouldn't have to know what you didn't want to know. This need for secrecy put a real strain on what was otherwise an extremely happy marriage. And one of the worst times began in 1939 when William was in charge of breaking Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher, a seemingly impossible mission. Unable to sleep, he would go downstairs and pace back and forth for hour after hour. Elizabeth could hear him, but she knew she couldn't ask what the problem was, and he knew he couldn't tell her. In 1940, William's team broke Purple, but afterward, he had a nervous breakdown. He ended up at Walter Reed on a ward with up to 20 other men who were also battling mental illness. There was only one psychiatrist for them all, Elizabeth remembered painfully. Patients were urged to confide in each other. For William, burdened as he was with military secrets, that treatment was wildly inappropriate. After 11 long weeks, he was released. He was told he'd had an anxiety reaction due to overwork. Perhaps that was correct as far as it went, but it was not the end of the story. For the rest of his life, William would go through cycles when his mind would race, insomnia would take hold, and he would fall into a deep depression. Elizabeth blamed these episodes not only on overwork, but also on anti-Semitism in the military. William had faced anti-Semitism in almost every aspect of his life, but at work he saw its ugly face up close. His immediate boss was an open-minded man and a good friend. Yet elsewhere in the Army, anti-Semitism was common and sometimes extreme. Many Army intelligence officers were obsessed with the idea that Jews were a threat to America. After World War I, they spent years building up a massive internal file on the, quote, Jewish question, end quote. It included lists of prominent American Jews, and it contained a report called The Power and Aims of International Jewry. The Army also endorsed eugenics and related racist and anti-Semitic theories, making them part of the Army War College course in the 1920s and 1930s. William had to work closely with officers who believed in these theories. To face such constant prejudice year in and year out was a heavy burden. But if anti-Semitism contributed to William's breakdowns, there was another factor at work too. Later in life, he would be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which had no effective treatments at the time. It was simply left to William and Elizabeth to find their own way through. It's a testament to them both that they did so. After his breakdown in early 1941, William never tackled the highest level code breaking again, but he was back at his desk in 3 months. He later brokered some of the most critical intelligence agreements of the post-war era. His successes, however, were punctuated by periods of despair. During these low points, Elizabeth supported him, just as he had supported her during her own early times of despair, illness, and setbacks. Still deeply in love, they had always seen themselves as a team, each upholding the other. To them both, that was simply part of what love was for. If William's breakdowns marked the lowest points of their lives, one of the highlights was a cryptology project they pursued in retirement. After years of working separately and in secret, they joined forces to study the problem that had brought them together, Shakespeare, and ciphers. They wrote a book that proved once and for all that there were no ciphers in the first folio. It was a great success, winning them international acclaim. Here they are at one of their bookstore events. By this point, they had been married for 40 years. They had been codebreakers for even longer, but they were still deeply in love with each other and with cryptology, and they were looking forward to writing more books together. Sadly, they had bargained without the NSA, which was unnerved by the book publicity that William was getting. NSA wanted its employees to keep a low profile, and by low, they meant invisible. So NSA started clamping down on William. At one point, the agency went so far as to raid the Friedman's personal library, a move that neither of them ever forgave. Elizabeth was outraged by the way the NSA treated her husband. She also feared that the agency would never allow the full truth of his achievements to be made public. After his death in 1969, she devoted herself to ensuring that the record was set straight, insofar as the Espionage Act allowed. She cataloged their library. She helped ensure his papers were preserved. She gave interviews. She didn't pay nearly as much attention to preserving her own story, but she did make sure her papers were saved as well. Those papers are now held at the Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia, in 22 gray archival boxes. Box 21 holds this gem, perhaps my favorite in the whole collection, the diary she kept in her 20s during her college years and through her engagement, the broken engagement, and then Riverbank and meeting William and her early marriage. Biographers like me are thankful that these papers still exist. We're also grateful for all the government files that have been declassified and for all the photos she and her husband saved. These photos include this gem from the 1950s. Recently, the Marshall Library discovered still more photos, which are being cataloged now. We can only hope that even more buried treasure comes to light over the years, because it's thanks to this wealth of records that we are coming to understand more and more about Elizebeth Smith Friedman's hidden life and to appreciate the full scope of her staggering achievements. Thank you. I'm now going to turn things back over to Thorin, who is going to help us with the Q&A period.
Thanks so much. That was super, really a lovely summary, and you got in a lot of what's in your book, although I will admit there's a lot more in your book than what you've just added to us here, but really super. Thanks so much. And again, I'll just reach out and just say, if you have questions for Amy, please type them in the Q&A window and I'll get them in front of her. If I might just start off the questions with a question of my own. I wonder a little about where your interest came from. And, you know, you include in the book, which you didn't hear, but you included in the book a number of ciphers and a number of codes and techniques to break them. And you really seem to get into it. And I wondered, did you have an interest in code breaking or codes before this? And what sparked your interest?
Well, my interest was sparked a very long time ago. I'm probably one of the people who knew, one of the few who really knew about her in her dark ages, because when I was somewhere, I guess I was nearly 10 when we moved into an old house that had been owned only by one family. And up in the attic, they kept all kinds of things, including old magazines. And in a box up there, I discovered a lot of Reader's Digests from the 1930s and early 40s, including one article from 1937 that was a profile of Elizabeth at the time when she was most famous. And I was fascinated by this. And I did look to see, was there a biography of her in the library somewhere? Could I read about her? And didn't find it. But that doesn't surprise you when you're a kid. There's so many things you haven't heard of that everybody else knows about. So I didn't think too much of it. I became interested in code breaking again as a parent. When my daughter was 7, 8 or so was the age she became fascinated by codes and ciphers. I'm married to a mathematician, so I guess it's no surprise it started early. We live not too far from Bletchley. I live in England. And we took her there. We took her to see another exhibition on codebreakers in Oxford. And in that one, we looked at many portraits. We saw an exhibition on Jewish codebreakers. We came out of one of these, and it had been all portraits of men. And my daughter looked up to me and she said, "Mommy, were there any girl codebreakers?" It just smote me in the heart. And I said, yes, there were. And I started to tell her about Elizebeth Friedman. And I thought, I would really like to write something that will also work, not for the 7 or 8 year olds, but, that will work so that younger people feel comfortable with it. And that would also get across some of the principles of code breaking. And I thought long and hard about how could I include some sections that show you how this actually worked, because it's wonderful to hear about everything that she did in her life and all the relationships she had from that. But I personally felt there would be something missing if you couldn't understand what's the difference between a code and a cipher. And then the next step is sort of what's a very simple cipher, how does that work? And to gradually lead the reader on. And I'm delighted because I do hear from readers who just say that's their favorite part in the book. And we colored this section slightly differently so that if there was a reader who really just wanted to go through all of that, they can look for the gray sections in the book and just go straight for them.
Excellent, excellent. Well, there's a number of questions that are coming in, so let me pose a few of them to you. One is just to clarify a little bit more detail about her. When did she die, and did she convert to Judaism? Did her kids know what their mother and their father did? So a couple of biographical story questions.
Right, yeah. So she was born in 1892. She died in 1980. Her husband had died, as I think I mentioned, in 69, and she spent that last decade or so, the early part of it, really working to save his reputation and what she could of her own. Her last few years, she was more confused, and at the very end, she was quite frail, but she did a lot in those years she had left. Her children, Barbara and John, one born in 1923, one in 1926, they did know some of what their parents did, particularly in the 20s and 30s, where up until you got close to World War II, it was a little easier to talk about this stuff without the full security establishment coming on top of you. And especially with their mother having to go to trials, they knew about that. And Barbara remembered it later as it was just very difficult to see her mother go to those because her father would joke about the gangsters taking her mother for a ride, and she knew what that meant. They joked about it in part because she was offered very rarely protection. Occasionally she would be given a bodyguard, but most of the time, they would find out where she lived because there were all these articles about her. And it's something that later on helped make many people in the security establishment rethink, do we use our code breakers in public court cases? Maybe that's not such a great idea. But at the time, yeah, she was this one-woman powerhouse doing it all, and she was a public figure as well. So her address was known.
And her religion, you say that how the family suffered from anti-Semitism to some degree, particularly William in the NSA and working with the army. Did she convert to Judaism, or did she remain in the faith that she was born in?
She remained, to some extent, in the faith she was born in. She remained Christian, but she was more of a transcendental Christian. I think in the end, part of what she valued about the Quakers was the reputation for tolerance. And so she was very interested in that heritage. They did get married in a synagogue by Emil Hirsch, the great Reform rabbi in Chicago at the turn of the century. They also gave the children the option to make their choices. And I think in the end, neither chose to become Jewish, but it was against a background where there was an enormous amount of prejudice at the time. I think that it was something for them both, that you can see that there were different points of tension. His family, I think, was even more upset than hers was about the marriage. It was a time where there were not a lot of intermarriages, particularly in the community he'd grown up in. And he was the first to marry out. And that just was such a shock. I think his brother said, it would have been better if he'd committed a murder. His mother just completely collapsed, and Elizabeth was very worried that maybe they had killed her. What should they do? What were they making? A terrible mistake. So they tried as much as they could to broker some family understanding. But I think that was something. There's a letter that William writes to his daughter at the end of World War II, talking about religion, because that's a point where she had thought, partly due to peer pressure, she struggled a lot with anti-Semitic remarks, things that were said to her. She struggled in her teens, and she had gotten confirmed as an Episcopalian at one point, but then said, no, that's not for me. So there's a beautiful letter about religion, and where he does talk about that and talk about having the freedom of choice, and also his belief in science as well, and trying to reconcile that with religion. And it's a lovely, open-minded, tolerant, very loving letter, understanding all the complications in a very real way. They were pioneers of trying to do this, trying to bring up children with a sense of both faith.
I think I get a sense of it here, and it certainly comes across in your book. You strike me as somebody who really got caught up with this collection, and you convey that enthusiasm of finding these documents like you've done here, and it just helps the book become all that more riveting. So I just want to convey that you captured that enthusiasm so nicely, your own enthusiasm.
I'm so happy to hear that. I was going to say, I got completely lost in the records when I was at the Marshall Library. They were so wonderful to me. They kept the library open extra hours because I was coming from such a long distance away. But they would have to remind me to go get lunch. They would sort of tap me on the shoulder, and I'd say, I'm going. They'd come back an hour later, and finally they'd walk me over to the canteen and say, you have to eat something. And I would, but my head would be lost in the love letters. We don't have Elizabeth's love letters from World War II. Those went missing, which is not so surprising since they had to go all the way to France and get back, and a lot of things to get lost. But his are there. They are exquisite. They're so beautiful.
That raises a question that I wondered about, which was, although much of your book is about Elizabeth's accomplishments, and particularly her accomplishments at a time when facing all kinds of stereotypes about what women should do that limited the role of women and limited what she could do even. And yet you weave into your story the romance and William and their relationship. And it's a big part of the book. And I just wondered about your decision. What made you decide that you should include that romance, include him in such a big degree, given that the focus is very much on what she overcame and the fact that she was lost to history because she was a woman?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple of things that went into that decision. One of them, quite simply, is that whenever you're researching one or the other, you just find that, they became codebreakers together. To explain even how she got into this field, you have to talk about that. But also, it was an extraordinarily close marriage, and they saw it, each of them, as really the core of who they were. To not talk about them, I think, is problematic. And I would say that had I been writing about William, a lot of the book would have had to include Elizabeth. But I would also say one of the things that comes up in reading about Elizabeth, also to some extent about William and work that's been produced before, people have this tendency to want to be Team William or Team Elizabeth, that, you know, one or the other is great and the other one is difficult. And I really wanted to write something that celebrated them both. That this was a very modern marriage at a time when almost no marriages were like it. I also think that it's important to make the point, since I wanted this book to be accessible to teen readers, to people just starting out, thinking about what they want to do in life, that part of what allowed Elizabeth to do what she did was having a supportive partner, that was critical. And the other thing that played into that decision about how I wrote the book was that to Elizabeth, it was extraordinarily important that William not be denigrated. She had to live a life where, I mean, there was no question, once you were married to somebody, even if you yourself have not converted, she has seen him deal with the effects of anti-Semitism. She herself is, I mean, places they could have gone on vacation, all kinds of things were affected by that. So she also is dealing with some of that, but she really felt very strongly that she got frustrated. She said William would just laugh when people said, oh, she's the smart one, she's the really brilliant one, which they did in the 1930s. Like, he knew nothing till she taught him things, and she would get frustrated. He would just laugh and say, no problem. But she really thought that was a problem if it went down as the permanent record. So in all fairness to them both, and I felt, you know, I would have Elizabeth's blessing and making sure that William was included. I do feel you can't understand her full story unless you understand some of his.
Well, it also just makes for a really wonderful narrative, because we get into that family, that couple, and we really learn so much about that relationship. So I think it worked very well. A couple more questions I want to get to. Somebody's asking about, where did Elizabeth come from in Indiana, and where did she educate herself about ciphering to begin with, or deciphering to begin with? How did she get that knowledge?
She came from just outside of Huntington. A lot of things will tell you that she was born in Huntington. If you talk to the locals, I was very lucky to be able to talk with somebody there who's a local historian and whose father went to the same one-room schoolhouse as Elizabeth did. And they are from a community they call Zanesville, and the Smith family farm was in Union Township, which is kind of between Zanesville and Huntington. If you're on the local ground, these things matter. She didn't grow up in the city. She grew up on the farm, and they only moved into town a bit later for her last bit of high school. So she did grow up roaming those fields. I think it helps explain some of her independence, that she was tiny, and while she was sickly, she was also, when she wasn't sick, she was just rowing boats, and she loved canoeing, swimming, all kinds of water sports, which was unusual at that time. So if you could remind me again where the second question is.
Where did she learn how to?
Oh yes, where she learned. She went first to Worcester College in Ohio, transferred to Hillsdale. At a time, Hillsdale is different now from what it was then. Back then, it was had abolitionist roots, had a student body that had Black students as well as white, unusual at the time, co-ed. She says in one radio interview that she learned a little bit about ciphers and codes at Hillsdale, but there's not a lot of evidence of that, of her knowing very much about it. She may only have known that they were there, that these things existed. Almost all of her education about codes and ciphers happened at Riverbank. She really went from she goes there for an interview in late May of 1916, and in April of 1917, so less than a year later, she is the co-leader of this Center for American Code Breaking. It's just an incredibly rapid transition.
Yeah, and you talk about how she broke codes by hand. And yet we also know that the Alan Turing is working on the early computer for breaking the Enigma machine in Bletchley Park. I'm wondering, and somebody asked this question too, just to what degree was there any kind of communication about this new computer way to break codes or machine way to break codes? And am I right that she always, for her entire career, she did it by hand?
Yes, she really preferred hand ciphers. She didn't like machines. And in fact, she said when the computers came and it ruined everything. So she always preferred doing that, which made her very good with the spy communications, because a lot of those are encoded by hand, again, because it's the simplest thing to do when you're on the run. In comparing her with Turing, it gets a bit complicated. The machine that Turing was working on solving, Turing and a whole team, he is one very important person, but there are others who are important. They are working on a type of Enigma machine that has many more, I think it's 159 quintillion possibilities. The one that Elizabeth is working on is quite a bit simpler, and it has 48 billion, which is still an awful lot, but it's not 159 quintillion. And again, it's simpler because spies are using this kind of Enigma. The technical thing is it doesn't have a plug board, which adds a whole realm of possibilities. She's also getting a lot of tips from the British because they've already broken it by that time. So she knows a great deal about this machine going into it. And it's possible to break it by hand, which is what actually the British team that works on this type of Enigma does. You break it by hand because the bombs, the machines that Turing was making to break it are, there aren't enough of them at that time. And so you put into it only things you cannot break by hand. So it was actually really important, both Elizabeth's team and the team working on this in Britain, that they did their work by hand, because that saved the bombs for the even more complex type of Enigma messages. And that's in no way to denigrate. Every codebreaker brings different things, and that's part of why it's so important that there are many different minds and many people from many backgrounds. Because what Turing was really good at, Elizabeth was not as strong in, but she had other strengths that were also very important for code breaking. And the same thing between William and Elizabeth. They were approached problems very differently, but that's part of what meant that they worked together really well. If you do want to compare Turing to someone in America, it would be William, because William also completely transforms the field. But again, he does it in a very different way from Turing. So these kinds of comparisons get really, the more you dig into the history of code breaking, the trickier they get to be. They are all great in their own way.
We've only got time for probably one or two more questions, so let me pose at least one more, which is about, does the NSA or the CIA or the federal government today recognize the achievements of Elizabeth Smith Friedman?
They do, which has been wonderful to see. And in fact, one of the things that Elizabeth was really happy about, I think it's the mid-1970s, the NSA decided to name one of its auditoriums, its most important one, for her husband. But since then, they have named it the William and Elizabeth Friedman Auditorium, and many people go there. In fact, I've spoken to GCHQ, which is NSA's UK partner, and they recognize the name Friedman because of that auditorium. So I was explaining why is this auditorium named, because it's clearly a very important name, because this is where everybody goes. But there are also other awards that different branches of federal law enforcement have had to honor Elizabeth Friedman. There's been a Senate resolution, and things are changing. There's going to be a Coast Guard cutter named for her. So it was a long, dark period that is now, we're seeing some light finally shining on Elizabeth.
Wow, that's super. I mean, you mentioned some of that, but not the Coast Guard cutter. Oh, that's great. I think we need to wrap up now. There are a bunch of more questions, and Amy, if you're willing, I'll send them to you, and perhaps you'll be able to respond to some of them after the program ends. I hope that's possible.
Yes,
I want to thank you, Amy, so much for this presentation and for the book. I mean, really, it's a super book, and it certainly draws a great deal of attention to a woman that seems like otherwise would have been lost to history. And so you bring that to us, and it's very rewarding to read that and to hear this presentation as well. And to you out there who are watching, thanks very much for joining us. And I hope to see you at some of our other programs soon. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and thank you so much for being here. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Have a great evening or afternoon. Bye-bye.